Redfall is fine. After a few patches, it might even be a 7 out of 10 for fans of the setting, but a 6 out of 10 for a broader audience seems fair. Like most games, it's better in co-op, but even that feature can't make up for the tired, uninspired mechanics and just how non-committal and safe it feels. Of course, uninspired and safe are descriptions that hold true for many AAA games that stick to what's popular, rather than offering something interesting that might prove divisive. But Redfall feels particularly disappointing coming from a developer with Arkane's pedigree. Much of the initial and ongoing criticism fixates on its technical state, but these are elements that can be resolved with a few patches. The focus should be on highlighting just how generic, empty, and even unfinished it can feel at times. I'd go even further and argue Redfall never will feel complete or cohesive, but its core design, a perfunctory reskin of a well-trodden open-world co-op shooter formula, is structurally antithetical to everything that Arkane does well. You see, playing Redfall is an immediately familiar but at times anachronistic experience that the intriguing premise, a few interesting power upgrades, and Arkane's stylized angular aesthetics just can't elevate above mediocrity. After 10 hours split between two characters, I describe it as a co-op Far Cry with vampires. A little more restrained when it comes to the amount of filler, but still formulaic and predictable to the point of exasperation. The premise is not without some neat ideas. Ancient vampires from another dimension, the infiltration of a pharmacology company focused on blood products, while the atmospheric, autumnal, and illogically isolated New England setting is, in theory, everything you could want for a great horror game. It's also got a quirky angle, with 4 protagonists that fit entertaining archetypes, all self-absorbed and often insincere to the point it feels like they're saving the town to satisfy their own ambitions. It's a shame then that the storytelling feels half-baked and is undermined by the mission structure and the inherent lack of pacing in open-world games. Each character may have unique dialogue when interacting with new NPCs, completing mission objectives, or during the storybook-style cutscenes, but nothing of significance changes based on your pick. Dialogue often references a team, making solo play weird. Scripted conversations with the secondary cast ignore their presence entirely, and key NPCs are relegated to standing around repeating generic lines and selling you gear for most of the game. If you actually want to find some interesting documents or psychic echoes that flesh out the world and backstory, you have to actively ignore waypoints during missions, or hunt down 100 ghostly audio logs, scattered seemingly at random for padding purposes. In contrast, you can look to 2012's Dishonored, which featured a silent protagonist, yet made interactions between Corvo and the secondary cast feel more animated, natural, and inclusive. It had a multi-stage side quest system that told secondary stories, and dozens of carefully placed documents or audio logs along your path, several of which could change based on your prior actions, all complemented by intricate environmental storytelling. If you paid attention, many future targets and plot twists were foreshadowed. Redfall just has unconnected side quests with minimal narrative context, and piles of corpses and blood trails to remind you bad things have happened. Now, the reason I'd rate Redfall as just above average is the combat. Traversal feels smooth, the gunplay feels suitably punchy, powers are both useful and visually striking, blasting human cultists or shadowy agents is satisfying, and staking smug vampires is always good fun. Human enemies are simply differentiated by their arsenal, but vampire variants demonstrate a little more creativity to keep combat more dynamic. That's all fortuitous, as running and gunning is really the only way you're going to play Redfall, given the stealth system is unexpectedly crude and inconsistent. There's no lean mechanic, there's no dedicated takedown beyond thwacking basic foes from behind for a hilarious ragdoll effect, and it often highlights the buggy AI with inconsistent detection and reaction ranges. Now, you could argue the looter-shooter gear system and skill trees are there to add depth, but while you clearly become more effective in battle, gear and skill upgrades really result in new tactics or traversal options like you'll have seen in Arkane's prior games. The classes, despite their quirky titles, offer the usual left bumper skill, right bumper skill, and double bumper ultimate, and most are just supernatural reskins of abilities you've seen in PvE shooters or battle royales for years now. There are 3 branching tiers of power upgrades and character buffs that add a bit of versatility, but it's the usual assortment of reconnaissance scans, brief invisibility, area of effect attacks, summonable decoys, minions or weapons, and even healing auras. It's a far cry from Dishonored or Deathloop's creative abilities. The tiered gear system is instantly familiar and equally underwhelming. With only a few variants of a half-dozen weapon types, think pistols, shotguns, machine guns and rifles, and only 2 trinket slots, you end up collecting dozens of the same items and scrapping most of them. Even the more interesting variants like a flare gun, UV gun and stake launcher still fill familiar roles. Of course, high-level gear offers improved basic stats, and rarity tiers increase the number of added effects, but enemy scaling ensures it feels like you're just keeping pace, and the battles continue to play out much the same way. As this was developed by Arkane Austin, who developed the incredible Prey 2017 and its Mooncrash expansion, You might expect detailed interactive environments and flexible mission designs to carry the game, but sadly that's not the case at all. What surprised me most is that Arkane Austin is no stranger to large and complex maps. Despite fantasy or sci-fi trappings, they've often built dense and believable spaces that felt lived in. In contrast, Redfall just feels big and static, with lazy enemy spawns, respawning item boxes and doors that relock themselves, an expanding list of busywork activities, and far too many empty locations waiting to be populated when a mission demands it, often repeatedly for side quests, and sometimes right after you've passed through them to get to a mission marker. Those missions range from randomly generated busywork, which also features in several story missions as well as the side quests, to moderately engaging multi-part objectives that never evolve beyond finding a thing, activating a thing, or destroying a thing. Story missions do at least feature more fleshed out locations and demonstrate just a little bit of Arkane's multiple approach mentality. The problem is those alternate paths are usually the equivalent of picking a lock on a door, hacking a garage door, or just climbing through the window between them. They feel almost obligatory, and no matter how you approach an area, you're just being funneled into the next battle, where the quality of your gear and your aim is all that counts, not the approach you took to get there. I guess at this point it's also worth highlighting just how disappointing the visual quality, lack of interactivity in the world, and the 30 frames per second cap feel. Interiors fare better, but on the whole, Redfall looks objectively worse running in Unreal Engine 4 in 2023 than the 7-year-old Dishonored 2 looks using their decade-old Void engine. I have no idea what's going on behind the scenes to not hit higher resolutions and frame rates, but to reiterate, the technical state of Redfall is the least of its problems. Ultimately, the classes feel too familiar, the loot system is too generic, the AI is inconsistent, and the world looks crude, artificial, and forgettable. I can recall and probably sketch out most locations from all 3 Dishonored games with reasonable accuracy, while the town of Redfall I've just spent 10 hours in is a blur between objective markers. Even in co-op, the basic gameplay loop swiftly settles into a monotonous rhythm of explore, loot, shoot, maybe unlock a safe house for even more busy work, and periodically tackle a boss that's just a tougher variant of a special vampire you've seen before. Repeat that a half dozen times on one map, then do it again on the next. Now I understand this design might be a consequence of the co-op focus. As a methodical, pacifist ghost who spends 90% of any game in a crouch walk, I can merely spend upwards of 2 hours systematically exploring Arkane's largest levels, and I doubt I'd ever find a co-op partner sane enough to join me in that endeavour. That said, I've also sunk more than enough time into all the Borderlands games in co-op to appreciate the thrill of looting, shooting, and watching numbers go up with friends. The problem is Redfall feels like it's straddling the fence between genres, and it doesn't want to commit to being anything. If you want a simple comparison to summarise my thoughts, I'd say Redfall is to Dishonored what Wolfenstein Youngblood was to Wolfenstein The New Order. It feels like a gradual bastardization of a great concept into something moderately enjoyable by virtue of retaining a few core elements, but far from that original greatness. Having said that, I'm not against developers trying something new, and I don't expect studios to just develop sequels or spiritual sequels forever, but Redfall doesn't feel like a sincere effort. If this had been marketed as Arkane Austin experimenting with new genres thanks to Xbox Game Pass, and maybe sold at a AA price point to those without a sub, I would say just fine would have been an acceptable result. The problem is Redfall is a heavily marketed, console-exclusive game sold at a premium $70 equivalent, and described as, and I'm taking this verbatim from storefronts, an open-world, single-player and co-op FPS from Arkane Austin, the award-winning team behind Prey and Dishonored, continuing Arkane's legacy of carefully crafted worlds and immersive sims. Redfall brings the studio's signature gameplay to this story-driven action shooter. You can basically disregard almost everything in the second sentence. With that sort of marketing and hype, releasing a game that's just fine should never have been an acceptable target for Arkane Austin or Microsoft as the publisher. If you've got this far, please consider giving the video a like and maybe subscribing to our channel as it helps us grow.